Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of the American Justice Podcast. This is special edition number 1. Let me introduce my guest today. We have a fellow podcast host with us, Mr. Jacob Trimmer. And Jacob, why don't you introduce yourself and your podcast and kind of tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, man. No, I didn't realize I was going to be the first one. Now I feel pressure.
Well,
I do a
trust me,
podcast.
if you heard the rest of our podcast, there's no pressure.
Fair enough. I do a comedy history podcast with a buddy of mine. We're both comics, and I mostly cover criminals, just because that's kind of been my professional and personal background.
Right.
I majored in criminal justice. My dad's been a cop since I was 6-7 years old. And I had my brushes with the criminal justice system. It actually involved me being booked in a jail by my father at one point.
Oh, no.
So I've been on both sides of things.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not as fun as it sounds.
That must have been kind of awkward.
Yeah. Luckily, he wasn't wearing his name tag that day, so none of the other inmates knew that we were related.
Nice. That's awesome.
But and then, like, some of the people that I've talked about on my podcast, I've seen that, like, the wrongful termination or wrongful conviction thing turn up a few times.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it was exponentially bad. Like how willing, like, the court system was to kind of skirt what they're supposed to be doing, and how much of an impact it had on a person's life after getting wrongfully convicted.
Right. That's one thing that I think that definitely doesn't. I feel like the criminal justice system doesn't fully compensate somebody for the time that they lost. I mean, and the other problem is that people that come out of prison that have been wrongfully convicted for 10, 15, 20 years, I think that even it's just some states, not even all states, but some states will compensate them for the time that they were in prison. But the difficulty in that is that you really have to prove that you were innocent. It's not like one of these things where, they come back and the DA just dismisses the charges because they're no longer confident in the conviction. It's like in order to get that compensation, you have to prove that you were completely innocent and that there's no doubt, like with DNA and stuff like that. So, but I mean, you could ask anybody. I think the average is like 80,000 a year or something. You could ask anybody, say, look, I'm going to take 20 years of your life and I'm just going to put you in prison and lock you in a box. But when you get out, I'm going to give you $80,000 a year. Would you do it? And, you can't take the money with you, right? But the time that you're away from your family and the time that you're away from, everybody is irreplaceable, I think.
There's no way to compensate someone in any way for the time lost behind bars.
Right.
And when you get into, like, the weird prison politicking you have to do, and how, like, very small things can erupt into violence,
Right.
the money doesn't matter. Right. If you have to shit a certain way, or if you fart at the wrong time and it starts a fight, that level of, like, paranoia that it creates in a person, and then you get out after 20 years, you're still going to have those ingrained like, fears and anxieties. There's no way to go back in a normal society.
Right.
Especially since our system isn't actually designed to rehabilitate anyone. So, you might have $80,000 a year, but your life's not going to be the same.
Right, exactly. And there's, like you said, there's always the chance. I mean, you live with that constant fear every day that something could happen. There could be a riot and you just, you get killed, and there's nowhere for you to go. You're locked in a box. So
we've had a couple cases here. I live in Orange County, California, and just on, like, the county jail level, we've had a couple cases where they weren't wrongfully convicted, but they were killed for dumb reasons. Yeah. One guy, he got popped for urinating in public. One of the inmates got told by a guard dude was in there for a sex crime, and so they beat him to death. Another dude was booked up for stealing a car, nonviolent crime. They put him in a 2-man cell with a guy that was in there after confessing to 3 murders. And in the middle of the night, the guy choked him out and killed him.
Yeah.
I think he was like 2 months away from his release date. And like, that's a dude that was in there because he committed a crime. But again, stealing a car or pissing in public doesn't warrant a death sentence.
Right.
And if someone's in there for a reason, like they were innocent and they got just screwed over by the system, or they were forced to take a plea bargain because they couldn't afford a good lawyer, and something like that happens, you can't compensate the family for the loss of their loved one.
Right. Exactly. And, it's funny you should mention plea bargains, because that's like a whole thing that I want to do a documentary on someday, because I personally, without going, without having a 3-hour debate on it, I personally think that the plea bargain is the number one flaw in the criminal justice system, because,
I agree.
if a prosecutor was forced to charge and go to trial on every crime that they indicted, you would not see half as many as indictments, and you wouldn't see these people that are wrongfully convicted. The only ones that would go to trial would be the ones that they have irrefutable proof, basically.
100%. I think the last time I actually looked into it was I was talking with a teacher of mine who used to he worked for the sheriff's department, then went on to work for a local police department. And it was something like mid to high 90% of cases are handled by plea bargain.
Oh, yeah.
And the way our system's set up is we couldn't handle not having those cases handled by plea bargain, which is, like you're saying, it's a huge flaw.
Right.
Because a lot of the times people are getting more time than they should, or they're getting convicted for something they didn't even do.
Right.
Prosecutors' favorite tactic is hit you up for major crimes and then offer you some crappy lesser included.
Right.
And people will take it because it's like, either I take the year in county, or I'm looking at 9 years in state pen, and I'll take the year.
Right.
And sometimes they're not even guilty of the crime. They just know they can't fight it.
Exactly. That is true. And the other thing about that is, I think the plea bargain does two things. It gives the guilty person less time, and it gives the innocent person time. It's like you just said, that you're faced with, let's just say, for an example, the attorney that I used to intern with, he only handled false allegations of sexual assault. And 9 times out of 10, it's a custody battle, and it's mom saying that dad touched the little girl just so she can get custody of the girl. And what they don't understand a lot of times is, when you say something like that, and then they coerce the little 5, 6, 7-year-old to say that, yeah, daddy touched me, that's not just a custody thing. That guy's going to jail. And he gets charged with something. And I don't know about California, but in Texas, you touch a little girl and you're facing 5 to 99 years. And so what they'll do is they'll come back, and we had this so many times. They'll come back and they'll charge you with, aggravated assault of a child. And then they'll say, okay, well, we'll give you 8 years in the state pen. You register as a sex offender for the rest of your life. Or if you want, we can go to trial. We can put your little daughter up on the stand, and she's going to testify, and the jury's probably going to give you 30 years or 40 years or maybe even 50 years. So do you want to take that gamble, or do you want to plead to the 8 years? And the next thing you know, you've got some guy that did absolutely nothing wrong, but fight with his wife and not want to be married to her anymore. And he's spending 8 years in prison, and he's registering as a sex offender for the rest of his life, and he didn't do anything.
And those are the worst years you can spend in a prison, because anyone finds out, and that's not hard to find out what someone's in prison for.
Exactly.
It's at best you're going to get beaten and other things I'm not going to go into details on.
Right.
But it's easy to become a death sentence, and it's one of someone who's guilty of it deserves all those repercussions. I have no pity or Well,
Right.
I'm not afraid to say, like, I don't care what happens to them. If they're guilty of that crime, whatever happens to them inside is fine.
Right.
But if somebody's innocent of that crime and they're being falsely accused for whatever reason, I don't know exactly how prevalent it is. I haven't dealt specifically in that, and I only know of one case offhand that was a local one that was years ago.
Mhm.
But I know how much it can ruin someone's life to be falsely accused of something like that. Even if you're cleared legally,
Mhm.
your personal life's ruined.
Right. Exactly. That is
And
true.
if you're going to a state pen for 8 years, guaranteed Texas isn't any better than the state pens we have here. They're all pretty bad nationwide. You're not going to have a good 8 years.
Right.
Like your best case scenario is you're going to the PC yard, where if you're an innocent person on the PC yard, all of your friends are going to be child molesters, rapists, gang washouts, snitches. They're not really people you want to hang out with.
Right.
And that's if you're lucky enough to get an PC yard. Some states really don't care as much as California has had to because of the liability issues.
Mhm.
Like I'm pretty sure if you go to like a prison in Alabama, you're going mainline,
Right.
and maybe you get to PC up at some point, but you might not make it that long.
Right.
And if you're an innocent person, that's really fucking shitty.
Yep. So that's kind of, it's funny that you say that, not, hanging around certain people or whatever. The first
Mhm.
season that we did, or that we just finished, our first season was covering the Brandon Woodruff case, and he was convicted of capital murder in Texas. And through my
Mhm.
investigation and other people's investigation, we've realized that he's actually innocent. And one of the things, when I talk to him, is he talks about that fact, is that he's literally by himself down there. He talks to nobody, stays to himself, because he doesn't want to be around the general population down there, which is guilty of all of these heinous crimes. And he's just not that kind of person. And so he
Mhm.
finds himself, he ends up, basically kind of sticking to himself, because he knows that he doesn't want to uh, hang around with those type of people. And that's
That's
what
fair. 'Cause
that's what people run into when they're innocent and they get convicted.
if you don't have any kind of street cred going in,
Mhm.
it's really going to be difficult for you right off the bat to try to do anything. It's easy to fall for tricks like taking out, like getting something loaned to you with the understanding that you're going to pay back the favor,
Mhm.
or falling in with one of the prison gangs because you don't know what the politics are, talking to the wrong person.
Right.
I got
Sitting at
yelled
the
at when I
wrong
got to
table.
county. Yeah, that's another big one too.
Yeah.
It's not so bad on county level, but at prison, there are certain tables they belong to either a specific race or a specific person. You don't sit there, but you don't know it until you do it.
Right.
Um, my first encounter when I walked into county after getting put into my proper cell block was asking dude which bunk was mine, because I was like, oh, I have a number, but I don't know where it is. And then I had a dude scream at me because I asked a Mexican dude where my bunk was, and I'm not supposed to talk to them.
Oh, jeez.
Like that's a dumb thing I wouldn't have thought of ahead of time. I wouldn't have thought, oh, I can't talk to that guy because he's a little darker than me. It was just,
Right.
hey, you're the first person I see, and that sometimes can lead to being taxed, or you mark yourself as a new person that doesn't know the rules, so you're easy to take advantage of.
Hmm.
An innocent person going in that hasn't committed crimes, they're going to be victim to all that shit.
Yep. That is true. And so, just talking about wrongful convictions in general,
Mm.
I just pulled up the National Registry of Exonerations, and they
Okay.
say that since 1989, there's
Mm-hmm.
been 2,683 exonerations, and which translates into 24,150 years lost. And that one of the things that we talk about, and one of the reasons I decided to do a podcast basically strictly on wrongful convictions, is
Mm-hmm.
people still seem to have the attitude that if you're charged, you're guilty, and this criminal justice system is supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. But it's just human nature to look across as a jury member, look across and see a defendant sitting at a table defending himself against accusations that the state of Texas or the state of California or whatever state is accusing you of. And, most people think that if they're accusing him, they must have a good reason for it. And, so I think, I don't know if you've done this specific study, but the last I heard was like something like 90% of jury trials end in a guilty verdict. And anybody that thinks that 90% of the people that are tried are guilty is just fooling themselves.
I didn't know it was that high are you including federal and state? Because I know federal, they have like something like a 94% conviction rate.
Yeah.
So if you're mixing both together, that would make sense. I think state's a little lower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But especially in Texas, I know California is a little more, like most of the areas that you have are kind of like suburbs and a little more urban, but in Texas, there's so many of these rural, small towns that, the prosecutors and the investigators in that town, the sheriff's department, they pretty much run that town. And if you are accused of a crime, like you don't have really any chance unless you just happen to be rich and can bring in the OJ dream team or something. But, most of these people are not, most of the people are a product of the rural small town that they live in. And, if Sheriff Bob accuses, Billy Bob down the street of, dealing meth or whatever, like, you're pretty much about a 99% chance you're going to be convicted if you do go to trial. So, because no juror wants that in their town. And that's kind of what happened with Brandon is, he got tried in a very small town. And I think the jury just kind of erred on the side of, well, he probably did it, so let's convict him.
Oh man, it's supposed if the prosecutor knows that the jury pool is going to be say influenced by knowledge prior to the case starting, or if they have previous knowledge of like the cops involved or the prosecutor themselves or the defense attorney or the defendant, they're supposed to try to get the case moved to a new court location, but they're not going to bother with it if they can just get the conviction and move on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's got a decent case for appeal on those grounds, but that takes years and years and years. And that's even if sometimes judges will see a case where it should be appealed and there's like, well, I don't feel like doing it. And they just move on.
Yeah. Well, I actually, in addition to the podcast, I'm actually doing a docu-series on the case. And I interviewed the trial attorney. Her name was Catherine Ferguson. And we asked her about that. Like, why didn't you guys move the trial to another county? And the answer is basically, if we ask for a change of venue, we get assigned to whatever court they assign us to. It's not like we can pick it. We can't say, let's go to Dallas or let's go to Fort Worth or let's go to one of these bigger cities. And they were afraid that they would be assigned to an even smaller county than the one that they were in. And there was basically about 2 or 3 counties that were quote unquote available to them. One of them was Collin County, which she said had not had a not guilty in a capital murder case ever. And
that's not
right. And the other, there was a couple of other counties around there that were smaller. And so they actually did explore that, but that was just, sometimes there's a strategy to that. And sometimes there's, the biggest thing is when you do change a venue, obviously you want to go to a county where nobody's ever heard of the case. And unfortunately, this was kind of a pretty a popular case, for lack of a better word, around there. So, even people in other counties knew about this case. I mean, it was a 19-year-old kid, accused of killing both of his parents. It was pretty, it was pretty salacious when it came out.
You got the Menendez case.
Yeah, pretty much. So tell us a little bit about some of the cases that you've covered, some of the people, and kind of what kind of how you cover it, how you guys talk about it. I've listened to a couple of the podcasts. It's very interesting. It's very humorous. I definitely could tell that you guys were, comedians. And if you ask me, there's just one thing that you don't get enough of in true crime, and that's comedy.
Fair enough. Two of my favorite examples of a court just kind of screwing over a defendant. One was Tom Horn Jr., which was years and years ago. Like, I think his case was very early 1900s, late 1800s. And to be fair, the dude had killed a fair amount of people, both legally and illegally, through the course of his life.
Okay.
Because he served time working for law enforcement, and they also served time being a criminal, because that's just what people did in the Wild West at the time. And the last a murder he was ever accused of was the son of a family that was living near where he was working. And through the course of the trial, evidence was suppressed. There were people that were not allowed to testify, and ultimately he was executed for the crime. And people have gone back and looked at that case, and they've looked at the evidence that wasn't allowed. They've looked at some of the statements from people that weren't allowed to speak, and no examination of that case has found him guilty since the one that got him killed. And it's kind of like, in a sense, karmic balance, because he really did kill a bunch of people.
Right.
But to get executed for the one crime you didn't commit is such a crappy way to go.
Right.
And he didn't even get a good death. He got like a water gallows death, which is, hey, we're going to kick this switch, and then 10 minutes later, this waterfall is going to hang you to death.
Oh, jeez.
So you just get to watch water drip until it finally pulls you up enough to break your neck. And it's not, of all the ways to kill him, that was so dumb. But it does showcase, that's been a problem in our courts, where the suppressing of evidence and just wanting to get the guilty plea or guilty conviction, or in some cases, like targeting a person because of their past, which is what we saw with Scott Jr. Erickson. Right. Dude was a pretty established criminal, like national president of the Mongols, motorcycle club. He'd done some dirt over the years. So he was kind of, I won't say a bad dude, because I don't think he really hurt anyone that was innocent, but got involved in bad shit. And getting involved in a dumb bar fight that was instigated by another patron who pulled a knife on him and his friend. That's clear-cut self-defense. Like, guy pulls a knife on you, you hit him with a glass, he goes down, you leave. That's self-defense. Right. You weren't using a weapon you weren't supposed to have. You just used a beer glass that just happened to be in your hand. And the LA County cops, or LA sheriffs, whichever one it was, that handled the case, hid the knife. They suppressed witness statements. They didn't allow things to be brought into court that would show that it was, in fact, self-defense. Right. In fact, he went so far as to threaten the bartender with a possible felony. Like, hey, if you tell anybody in the court that the guy had a knife and that it was a self-defense case, we're going to put you away for however many years. I think it was like a possession thing. Right. And they maxed out his sentence on it. They gave him 14 years, 80% mandatory served. So he's doing minimum 12 years before he can see the light, or see freedom again. Right. And then through the course of that, he winds up getting really lucky, because a guy he's in prison with recommends he fill out a writ of habeas corpus. Show that there was, in fact, evidence that was suppressed, that things didn't get brought into the trial that would have showed his innocence. And when the judge granted him that writ of habeas corpus, he even said, in like the 30 years or however long this old piece of shit's been on the bench, he's never once agreed to a writ of habeas corpus.
Oh, wow.
Which is a huge thing for our judicial system. That's supposed to be, if there's even a chance, like, it's supposed to be, we let potentially guilty people go if it means that our system protects the innocent. And this was the opposite, where it's like, oh, well, I just didn't feel like bothering in those other cases, but you made it so clear that I had to take it, or I'm going to get hit with a corruption charge.
Right. And
they get him up on, they catch him up on like this dumb, not loophole. I'm trying to think of a word for it. He makes a dumb mistake. He goes to a place that has dudes in Mongols colors, and instead of leaving, he sits down and has a them. then leaves. And they had him on a non-association clause, which is another bullshit thing.
Right.
It shouldn't be a crime just to associate with somebody that happens to be a criminal.
Right.
I don't think that should ever be a crime. If you commit a crime with that person, yeah, that's a crime. But having a beer with them, that's dumb.
Yeah.
But they got pictures of him with that dude in the Mongols colors, which meant non-association clause is busted. They can throw him back into prison, even though he's out on bail. So they can revoke that. And now he's going to wait another 2, 3, 4 years before his retrial. So the prosecutor's like, hey, how about we just give you another 2 years on top of I think he'd already served 4 or 5 years at that point. So do another 2 years and then we'll let you go, and there's your plea bargain. So he ends up serving 6, 7 years on a self-defense case. It's like what Con Air was trying to do with what's his name's character, Nicolas Cage's character, where it's like, oh, it's self-defense, and now he's getting screwed. Like, this was a real person that had to go through that.
Yeah.
And none of those. He has an established rep in on the street as a Mongol. He'd already been to prison, so he knew what to do. He could defend himself. But even then, like, his home life was thrown into a whole disarray. He's sitting in a cell for most of his time. There's a part in it where he ends up having to fight a guy because he farts at the wrong point, which is the dumbest reason to have to be in a fight.
Right.
And this is a person that's like, he knows what he's doing inside and knows how to survive. And even then, it sounds like a miserable existence.
Right. I think it was it Sir William Blackstone that said, better 10 guilty men go free than one innocent be deprived of his freedom. And that's exactly, the criminal justice system just is completely opposite, I think, right now than the way it should be, And like I said, it's that whole preconceived notion that, when they come in, they look guilty. But it sounds like in this case, the prosecutors were just kind of the ends justifies the means. Like, whatever we have to do to convict this guy, let's do it because he's a bad dude.
That's how it was with Tom Horn. It was kind of a combination of both with Junior, because the jury just saw this dude as he's a bad person. He's got tattoos back when tattoos were scary. Right. He's got a criminal record because they brought up his previous stuff, and he looked like an evil person to them.
Right.
He even references in his book where when he goes back to get his sentence or to get his find out whether he's convicted or not, he saw one of the jurors in the elevator and kind of waved at her, and she almost spit on the ground, like just in disgust of him.
Oh, wow.
And it's that preconceived notion that the prosecutors were able to play on, where it's like, hey, they think he's a bad guy. We do a little behind the scenes finagling. We paint this picture of him being this evil person, easy conviction. That's exactly what happened.
Right.
And
that's that's actually that's exactly what they did in Brandon Woodruff's case, because they had no evidence showing that he was at the crime scene, that he was the one that committed the crime. So how did they convict him? Well, they made him out to be this big liar because he was coming out as being gay. So he was hiding his sexuality from his church friends and school friends. And the prosecution comes out and says, look at this guy. He's got 2 different lives. He's got one life where he's gay and dancing and partying all the weekend. And then he's got this other life where he's going to church and he's going to school and all this stuff. And, these 2 lives, he's lying to everybody. He's just a big fat liar. And if he can lie about being gay, then he can lie about killing his parents. And the jury bought it hook, line, and sinker with no evidence, no proof at all that he was involved in the crime at all.
What year was his trial?
2000. He was arrested in 2005. He was arrested 6 days after the bodies were found, and then the trial was in 2009, like 3.5 years later.
So in 2009, they were able to, because I'm guessing like a town of 10, 20,000 people.
I don't remember what it was back then. Now it's probably, I don't know, 100,000, 50 to 100,000.
Okay, so it's not like it was some backwater everyone's like a filthy hayseed town. Like there's enough people there where they should know in 2009 that just because somebody's gay and they're hiding the fact because they don't know how their family's going to respond doesn't make them a killer.
Right. Yes, they should. But this is also, a county that, I don't know, probably 90% of the people there are voting for Trump, if that tells you anything. So,
Well, you said Texas.
So, it's a very, and like I said, I think that it was with them, it was just more of we think he's guilty. We don't want him out on our streets. So, there was definitely not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But, the
Yeah, you said they couldn't even prove he was at the scene.
Right, exactly. So the strategy of, hey, he was hiding his lifestyle, and then when he would talk to the Rangers, he was like an hour and a half or so off on his times. Like he said, he went to pick up his friend at 9:30, and it was really 11. That type of thing. So he's just a typical teenager that didn't keep track of time. And, if you asked me where I was a week ago, I probably couldn't even narrow it down to an hour and a half, let alone, even remembering what I did that day. So,
So they questioned him 6 days after the bodies were found. I assume he didn't know until they told him that his parents were dead.
Well, no, everybody knew that. So the bodies were found on a Tuesday afternoon.
Okay.
And when they found the body, they actually hadn't heard from his parents from a couple of days, he or his sister. So they had a friend of the family go over and check on him because Brandon was 3 hours away in Abilene and his sister was 3 hours away in Arkansas. They were both going to college. And so they called a family friend. The family friend went and found him and said, yeah, they're dead. And, everybody knew that they were dead when they found him. Nobody knew that it was a murder. They just knew that they were dead because the police kept that whole, it was a murder thing close to the vest. But yeah, by the time that he was questioned 5 days after the murders, he knew that they were dead. Yeah.
So less than a week after he finds out his parents are dead,
right,
the cops show up and they say, hey, it's a murder and we think you did it. Answer these questions.
Right.
And because he was an hour off on his time, they were able to use that to show that, oh, he's a horrendous liar and he's got to be guilty of murder.
Right.
That is bad prosecution work. It is bad police work. Mm-hmm. Within a few days, like the amount of grief he's going through, whether or not like he was that close with them, even like there's a level of impact that's going to have on your ability to recall stupid things, like what time you were going somewhere on a night that you didn't think, oh, I better pay attention because I might need this in the murder case I'm going to have in a week.
Right, exactly. That's
like you were saying with like last week, like if somebody asked you wouldn't be able to get it within like a couple hours. If somebody asked me last night what I was doing at 11 p.m., maybe right. I was home, maybe I was driving at the time. I don't think to check that,
right?
Because I'm not a murderer who needs an alibi.
Right.
That's a very simple. If somebody has all their ducks in a row when you come to investigate a murder and they haven't answered everything, that person might be guilty.
Right.
Somebody that's like, hey, I think I was doing this. Yeah, still investigate them, but like that's way less suspicious than someone having an answer to every murder trial question.
Right. Exactly.
And to go that hard on it.
We actually hired a body language expert, and that's exactly what she said. She said, I would be very suspicious of somebody that knew exactly to the minute what they did, because, most 19-year-olds don't even own a watch. They don't even know where they were, what they did. And the fact that he even told the ranger, like, I don't know. And, so then the ranger came back and said, and kind of walked him through it. So, okay, you say you left your parents' house at 7:00. It takes 30 minutes to drive over to their other house, which was in Heath. So that's 7:30. You say you had to feed the animals and take out your parrot. So that would have taken you about 30 minutes, and he walks him through it and kind of ties him down to this, to this timeline that he's already told him, like, I don't know what time I went. And he's asking him, can you go check the phone records, check the toll records? Like, I really don't know. But they walk him through, and the attorneys that he had, I mean, we could spend 6 hours talking about this case, but the attorneys that he had were basically just kind of friends of the family, and they were like civil attorneys, like family law and stuff like that. So
you can't have a capital murder trial with a civil attorney.
Well, that was just when they were they were just doing a favor, sitting in on the interview or the interrogation. And they literally told him, don't argue with these officers. Don't, like you can. And then they told him, you could refuse to answer, but they have the option to throw you in prison for the rest of your life. So you better answer the question. I mean, it's like, there was so many, there's so many turns in this case where the criminal justice system just fucked him over.
Yeah, man. It's not like an everyday occurrence where somebody gets railroaded on a murder case,
right?
But it's heartbreaking, I guess, for to use the cliched term. Mm-hmm. Like when you hear the details of how much they were taken advantage of by some detective that just wants to clear a case and move on, or some prosecutor that wants to pad his record and move on.
Right.
I got called into jury duty a few years back, and it wound up being for a manslaughter case where the two defendants were claiming self-defense, and the prosecutor was trying to say, no, they don't get to have self-defense because we think they were in the middle of a crime when the person was shot. And listening to that prosecutor speak was just like trying to hold onto an eel. It's just all slippery nonsense and bullshit. Mm-hmm. And I'm lucky in the sense that I have so many built-in reasons to get out of jury duty. When they ask you like for California at least, they give you like these 10 questions, and it starts off with, have you ever been the victim of, suspect of, or witness to a crime? And that's the first question. I went, yes. And they went, what? And I got to explain all of my stuff. And then they get to like, do you have family in law enforcement? Could you be an impartial juror? And I just have plenty of experiences where I get to basically walk free. All my teachers for criminal justice that were former law enforcement, they never get picked for jury duty because they say they're former law enforcement. I had a sociology teacher who gets dismissed because he's a sociology teacher. Oh, like they really want to get people that they can influence through fancy talking.
Yep.
And that's not the way it's designed to work at all.
Right.
It's not supposed to be, hey, who's the most convincing with just the way they speak. It's supposed to be who has the most compelling evidence. And it doesn't sound like they had any evidence at all on this kid.
Right. And just to speak to jury selection, as you were just talking about, we have the transcripts of the jury of the voir dire, and there were several jurors that were like, well, wait a second, we don't get to choose the death penalty if we find him guilty, because they had told him, that, hey, the state is not seeking the death penalty in this case. And there were several jurors that were indignant that they were not able to to give him the death penalty if they found him guilty.
I hope the defense attorney dismissed them.
Oh yeah, those were dismissed, but the problem is you only get 12 preemptory strikes, and then you're just stuck with, so you're just stuck with, at that point you're just stuck with what you get. And if the whole jury pool is like that, what are you going to do?
It was, I think, 12 dismissals without having to give a reason.
Right.
But then if you can argue well why you want a person dismissed, like they just really show that they're not a good juror, you might be able to convince for more.
Yeah,
I think that's how it works.
Yeah, you can try to argue for what they call for cause. But that's that's up to the judge. You may say, you may stand up, let's say it's a black defendant, you may say, this person, we know that they're part of the KKK, so they can't be, an impartial juror. But then they turn to the juror and say, well, can you be impartial? And he says, yeah, Your Honor, I can be impartial. Then he may not strike him. You know what I mean? So that kind of stuff in these little small towns happens. And unfortunately, I think it happened in this case with as far as the gay bias.
That would make sense. I know. Was it the case for Michael Jackson's doctor after he was charged with whatever malpractice it was that caused Michael Jackson to die?
Yeah, Conrad Murray.
There were jurors on that trial, in that pool that didn't speak English and had to have a translator. And when it came time to trial, and they were using medical terminology that had to be translated into Spanish, that doesn't work.
Right.
Like there's no Spanish word for some of the pills that they were talking about,
right,
or some of the thing. And so it's another one of those examples like that. Sometimes like, okay, well, it's going to seem prejudiced, but like certain people should just be dismissed from a case if it's going to cause undue hardship on the defendant getting a fair, honest trial. A Klansman for a black defendant, a Westboro Baptist Church member for anyone that breathes.
Right. Right.
Anything that doesn't translate well. Like an average case, a translator is going to be fine. But if you need to use medical terminology or anything that doesn't translate well, I can't think of other things.
Any kind of like electronic technical stuff, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It especially since the system's designed to give the defendant every chance to not be convicted. Some of these things are just simple, like, okay, well, in the interest of pursuing justice, yeah, let's make this case or this trial a little more fair to them. And they've stopped trying to do that. And some trials in some courts are better than others. But
yeah, that was because when I asked Catherine Ferguson about why they didn't change venue, that was my question. Why didn't you just go to Dallas? Because Dallas would have been a lot more accepting or whatever. And that's when she explained, well, we can't really choose where we go. You know, you put in for a change of venue, and then it's up to the presiding judge or whoever to pick a county. And you know, and like I said earlier, the this county has, you know, probably back then probably had about 50,000-60,000 people in it, and the counties next to it had like 10,000. So you know, that's what they were kind of worried about, is going to these even smaller towns or smaller counties. And so yeah, sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not, but like I said, the goal of that is to try to go to a county where you have a fair shot and nobody's ever heard of the case. But that wasn't really you know, unless they could have moved it to maybe a bigger, like El Paso or San Antonio or something that that nobody's ever heard of the case. But it was pretty infamous here in Dallas Fort Worth area.
Yeah, anytime, like, I'm assuming that the murders were at least semi-brutal in fashion.
Oh yeah, they were both shot and stabbed multiple times.
Yeah, anything like that in a small-ish town that has any kind of like the level of brutality that they don't see, it's going to make the news. Here in California, we had a guy in LA that was found chopped up in a fridge, and I only saw it on like an off-brand news site. Like that's how jaded we are in big cities.
Right.
I know of a few. I had a friend of mine who was shot in Irvine, which is lauded as being one of the safest cities, and blah blah blah. He was shot to death. His mom was shot to death. Almost no media coverage. Fairly brutal.
Yeah.
But because it's near enough to these places that have real crimes all the time, even then, like this suburb, it doesn't become a big deal.
Right.
But you get out to those rural places where people still ride horses, not for fun. And
for transportation.
Be like, oh, yeah. Or it's like, oh, I have a DUI. I got to ride the horse to work today.
Nice.
It's going to get, and once you have a case that becomes well known enough to influence a juror pool, in his case, you're saying, yeah, if you can't pick the court, you're kind of boned. I can't imagine trying to get a fair trial as a gay kid in a town of 10,000 people in Texas.
Mm-mm. Not going to
Like
happen.
there's no way.
Yep.
People have a
So,
hard enough time in major cities.
right. And that's
Like avoiding that.
and that seems to be a general consensus that if it was tried in Dallas or Fort Worth or Austin or whatever, that he would not have been convicted, because there's just, there's, I like to say there's evidence, but there's no proof, because, evidence is the thing like we talked about with him being off on an hour and a half on his time. That's evidence. It's not proof, but it's evidence.
Right. It's what circumstantial evidence. It's not even like, it's not DNA or physical evidence. It's just, maybe he lied about the time, or maybe he was wrong about the time. Do they have any kind of like concrete evidence, or was it all just circumstance and a fancy way of talking to the jury?
It was all circumstantial evidence and character assassination. There was no, there was,
a murder conviction off of that.
Right. No, I agree. That's the whole reason I've been covering this case for so long, and we're doing trying to get the docuseries, trying to get it sold to Netflix and all that stuff. So, but yeah, when people, because when I first started looking into the case, I was the same way you are. Like, I'm sitting there looking through all the evidence. I've got boxes and boxes and boxes of evidence, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, okay, at any point, I'm going to turn the page and I'm going to find that thing that gave the jury a reason to convict this kid. And at the end of, I turned the last page and I'm like, I don't see it. There's nothing here that says that he was at the crime scene when the crime happened. And, the time that he was off, it's funny because he kept begging the investigators, like, go talk to my friends. Like, I was with my friends. Like, and so they finally, 2 weeks after they arrested him, finally went to talk to his friends. And even the friends were an hour and a half. They were like, yeah, no, Brandon got over to my house at 10:30. Well, turns out it was 11:30. It was like, teenagers are just bad with time. I mean, I'm bad with time. I'm almost 50 years old.
Did they recover the weapons?
So they never recovered the gun. They think that they recovered the knife, but it was forensically proved because they found. So Brandon, Brandon. I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version of it. Brandon owned a medieval sword dagger looking thing that he got from. He used to work at Medieval Times. He was a real big animal person, and he loved horses, loved training horses. So he went to Medieval Times.
Now I know. Nobody that buys a sword is going to use a sword.
Right. So, well, he actually didn't even buy this sword. Like a friend, the guy that he worked with gave it to him as a gift for just, helping him with the training and stuff. But they asked the roommate, like, 2 weeks after this, when we finally talked to him, was like, well, tell us about this dagger that Brandon owned. And he's like, oh, it's got like a 4 or 5 inch blade on it and maybe a 4 or 5, 6 inch handle. So almost a foot long. Well, after Brandon's in prison for 2.5 years, his aunt is going through the barn in the Heath house and finds this almost 2 foot long sword. But because it had a skull on the handle and it was medieval looking, they tried to pin it to being Brandon's. And, so
didn't match the description though.
Didn't match the description. But the problem was that, I mean, there's just so much to this case. The prosecutor showed the guy, the roommate, now granted, this is 3.5 years after he was questioned the first time. But they basically brought him into the office, showed him a picture that was on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and said, hey, is this the sword? And he kind of looks at it and he's like, well, yeah, I guess so. And then they show it to him in court and it's, 2 feet long. And he's like, wow, that does look a lot bigger than I remember, but Yeah, but anyways, so there was a whole, I mean, they violated the DOJ's, witness preparation guidelines and all that. There was just here's one of the big things that you're going to love being a criminal
Oh, no.
justice major. They recorded his phone calls between him and his attorney while he was in jail and listened to them.
What? Well, what? That's like entry level criminal justice knowledge. You don't record a conversation with a defendant and his attorney.
Right.
Privileged information.
Right.
Like that's enough to get a case tossed out.
Well, it wasn't like it was just incidental where, they said, here, record all of Brandon's calls and then turn them over to me and then, differentiate which ones are attorneys and which ones are not. She specifically told the chief jailer, record all of his calls, including the ones with his attorney, and turn them over to me. And so the judge obviously ruled that that they violated his Sixth Amendment rights, but he refused to throw out the indictment, basically just saying that, I'm going to throw out all of any evidence that they obtained from this. I'm going to throw it out. But then the attorneys were like, okay, well, we want to find out what evidence or what information they found out. So we want to call the DA that directed this and listen to the calls. And the judge like, no, you can't call the DA to the stand. So he's basically saying, I'm going to throw out all the evidence that they found, but I'm not going to let you find out what evidence they found.
I hope this kid's appealing the case, or someone's appealing it on his behalf.
Well, the problem, he did appeal it. He actually appealed that issue, the Sixth Amendment issue, all the way to the Supreme Court, because there's many different circuit courts in the United States that have differing opinions. Some courts say if they violate your Sixth Amendment rights, it's automatically thrown out. Some courts say, well, you have to prove that you were somehow harmed. So it's not an automatic dismissal, but you have to prove that you were harmed. Some courts say, well, even if you prove that you were harmed, you have to then come back and prove that it was deliberate and systematic. And, there's all these differing opinions. So we were actually really hoping that the Supreme Court would take it up, because there is all these different opinions in the circuit courts, but they ultimately did not, which means that the Fifth Circuit, which is down in Louisiana, who had the case, they basically decided that, they were one of the courts that said you have to prove that you were harmed. And, we came back and said, well, how are we supposed to prove we were harmed when they wouldn't let us cross-examine the ADA that did it? And, but if the Supreme Court refuses to hear it, that's it. It's dead. The only appeal that he has left is the writ of habeas corpus to go in and prove his innocence, but they're working on that. But it's very hard to prove. One of the things that we say in the podcast is it's hard to prove that you're innocent using the investigation that they didn't even prove you were guilty. So,
Yeah.
So unfortunately for him, that's where his case sits. But anyway, so some of the cases that you guys cover, I think you said earlier that you don't really talk about just going over specific case. You talk more about the people's lives and kind of what was going on in their situation, all that. Talk a little bit more about that.
We start early, generic stuff, like we give a birth date and some family and history about their childhood, if we have that information. Sometimes we don't, sometimes we do.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just kind of move through, and both me and Tim, my co-host, we look for things that are interesting or things that are potentially funny, like we can riff on, or things that are just funny in and of themselves.
Right.
We covered Tookie, the guy that founded the Crips.
Uh-huh.
And one thing I found out doing my research was, as a kid, like a very little kid, he would follow up after they did dog fights in the neighborhood. They would have him and other children then fight each other in the same place that the dogs were fighting. Okay. So they have dog fights and then baby fights in the same little pit. and everyone's betting on all of it. And I'm like, I have to include that.
People are just
His
sick
case,
sometimes. Like, that's crazy.
yeah. And then sometimes it gets bad. Like I don't know if you. I'm sure you, as a true crime fan, you've heard of Richard Chase, right?
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Sacramento Vampire.
Hmm.
There were a few details in that. Like I honestly, I still kind of feel nauseous looking at the pictures of that guy's kitchen.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I know. That's, well, you have to understand I'm an EMT, so blood doesn't
Oh,
blood has not been on the scale of making me nauseous in a long time.
see, the blood wasn't the problem. It was like the bits of baby skull and heart that were in his blender, where I was like, that is.
Yeah.
I don't like normal smoothies that much. I definitely don't want a Richard Chase smoothie.
Right. You don't
But
want
there
to
was
know
some,
that he opened a smoothie shop, right?
but there were some details in his case where it's like, oh, it gets real bad. Like I don't want to say it on here because I assume the people that listen to your podcast don't want to hear the descriptions of the things he did.
Right.
But so like going into it, some of the episodes when I start writing for it, I'm like, I gotta really hope we can riff on this horrible, awful thing and make it a little bit more palatable.
Yeah.
I have a few of my friends that have gotten into listening to it, and after certain episodes, like Dean Coral, Richard Chase, some of the ogresses, these women that got into the babysitting business so that they could kill the babies and collect money for them. There were some of these episodes where like my friends will then text me, or a friend of mine. She shaves my head and trims up my beard every few weeks when I go and see her because she's a barber. She'll listen to these episodes, and when I go and see her, she'll spend the whole time giving me shit for the nightmares I've given her.
Nice. That just means you're doing a good job.
And so every once in a while, like there are a few people I've covered where it's like I need a break from the monsters. I want to talk about a badass person.
Yeah.
So like Stagecoach Mary, who was the first black female to work for the Postal Service, was an amazing badass. Like she used to have she had a standing bet in the town's bar where if she could not hit, she would punch someone in the face, and if they didn't get knocked out, she would give them $5 and a shot of whiskey.
Nice.
No one ever collected.
No one ever collected. Nice.
That bet stayed in place until she died in her 90s, and no one ever collected. Wow. And I'm just like, that's an awesome old broad.
Right.
And so we run the gamut as far as some of history's worst monsters and some really cool people. Like I kind of mentioned it earlier, there were these three women, they were teenage girls at the time in the Netherlands. And during World War II, they got involved in the resistance, which led to them shooting Nazis and blowing up train yards and passing on messages and stuff like that. And so we sometimes cover those really cool people in history to balance out the evil that we talk about. And we try to blend both, obviously being funny because we're a comedy podcast, we're comedians trying to prove that we deserve to get paid someday. And then also with being like accurate to this person's life. Like we don't want to make up fake things about them. We want to find the facts that are at least mostly agreed upon by historians. Right. Sometimes there'll be like a story about something they did in their life where no one actually believes it happened, and I'll include those and just put like a little, before I say it, I'll just say to Tim like, oh yeah, this next one, no one believes it really happened, but it's so stupid I want to include it so we can laugh at it. And he had a few of those. Like he had one where it was the sister of who was Roman guy known for being like outrageously debaucherous. I'm blanking on his name.
What time period?
Ancient Rome.
Oh.
Like his name's synonymous with debauchery and fucked upness.
Caligula's?
Yeah, Caligula.
Yeah.
He covered Caligula's sister. And near the end of her life were these like wonky stories about like blowing up houses and weird, just made up stories. about her, and he had like 3 of them, and before he said them, he's like, look, no one thinks these are real, but who doesn't want to hear about this woman like smashing snakes and blowing up houses and doing crazy shit?
Right.
And like I said, I mostly cover criminals, and he mostly covers like ancient history and soldiers and stuff like that.
Oh, that's cool.
And it's the closest I've gotten to being able to take advantage of my degree.
Yeah, it's funny because, you know, being a true crime buff, like it comes up so many times in just everyday life. Like the other night, I walked in to the house and my roommate was watching a Netflix documentary. I was like, you know, after 2 scenes, I was like, what's that one about? He goes, oh, the Night Stalker. I was like, oh, Richard Ramirez? Oh, dude. And then I started telling him all about all about what he did, and, you know, all the women, and it was just, and he's just sitting there looking at me like, how do you know all this stuff? And it's like, well, it's kind of my thing. But why don't you tell everybody where they can find you, and you know, all the different streaming platforms and what URLs and stuff like that you have.
Oh yeah. Let me double check with the URLs for like our Twitter and stuff.
Sure.
We're on all social medias. Let Them Fight podcast. Fairly easy to find. For Twitter, it's, I think, podcast LTF, because somebody stole LTF podcast like an asshole. Yeah, at podcast LTF.
Okay.
And then Facebook is just the reverse. It's LTF podcast. We're on every platform for podcasts at this point. Like I even put us on Amazon Music.
Nice.
Because I was like, if I can get at least a few people to listen on Alexa, that's something.
Yeah, that's
and our logo, it's just a bloody fist and white background, because we didn't have a lot of money for a graphic designer.
Right.
So we got one that could do at least a decent job that conveys what we talk about.
Right.
And we release 2 episodes a week, because initially what we did was had 1 episode with 2 people on it. And we had a buddy of ours on, and we went long and had to release his episode split into 2. And he was like, why don't you just do that all the time? So much easier. You just listen to 1 person per episode than to hear 2 people covered, and they're going to pause in the middle. It gets weird.
Yeah.
And we're like, yeah, it shouldn't have taken us this long to know that.
Oh man, if I had $1 for every time I thought that to myself, I thought I should have known that a long time ago. Yeah.
I think the first episode we put out only played out of he only played out of the left speaker. I only played out of the right speaker, because I didn't know how to edit yet.
Nice. You know, even the ones like the True Crime Garage, if you go back and listen to their very first episode, it literally sounds like they were sitting in a park and they just put like their phone in between them while all the kids were, you know, like, I mean, it's horrible. And I think they luckily very quickly realized that, because even just the second episode is like much, much better. But and by the way, True Crime, if you're, I know it's asking a lot to go back and look at or listen to 28 episodes on Brandon's case, but True Crime Garage just covered Brandon's case last week in 2 episodes. So if you're interested,
okay,
do a little kind of background on Brandon's case. But they got a few things wrong, and there were, you know, so a lot, obviously only 2 episodes. They weren't able to get into a lot of the details, but with our podcast, like it literally gets into every single detail, and you know, we explain everything in the case, so it's interesting. But yeah, Let Them Fight. How'd you guys come up with Let Them Fight?
Me and Tim are both fat, scary looking dudes. And when I pitched the idea of doing a podcast, because it's like, we're comedians, we have to have a podcast. I thought of the name first, and what it was that scene from Godzilla where one of the newer ones, where the monsters go to fight and the Japanese guy says, no, let them fight. I was like, hey, we're both giant scary monsters. And I actually had a friend of mine go up and do some Photoshop with Tim's face put onto the body of King Kong and mine put on a Godzilla.
Nice.
To kind of match up with the name. And it just happened to, when we thought of an actual thing to talk about, which was violent people throughout time, it was like, oh, the name actually fits for the idea we have. So we kept it.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for being part of this. And hopefully everybody checks out your podcast, and we can
Thank you, man.
get some listeners for you.
Thank you, man. It was fun. I
Awesome.
don't get opportunities often to talk about like more of the nitty gritty stuff and in court cases and crime and whatnot.
Yeah. It's crazy what can happen out there sometimes.
Yeah.
Like literally crazy.
Thank you for
All right, man. Well, thanks again. And we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. And thank you guys for listening. And check out Jacob's podcast, Let Them Fight. You can just, most of the time, I think you can, even if you don't have the actual handle, you can just go to like Twitter or whatever and just search for Let Them Fight and should probably pull it up. But all right, guys, thanks a lot. We'll see you next time. Hope you enjoyed this special episode. Thanks a lot. Bye.